welcome. Perhaps the most hotly debated issue in the world is Israel's right to establish settlements in contested areas of land. Here, from the tinderbox of the conflict, is David Rubin, author of God, Israel, and Shiloh, Returning to the Land. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. Yeah, great. Well, you know, you also have another book that's just hot off the press. And what is the name of that book?
Well, that book is The Islamic Tsunami. Subtitle, Israel and America in the Age of Obama. And that is it's a book that's talking about the overall challenge to Western civilization faced by multiple threats in our times.
Right. Well, we can get into that a little bit as we go throughout the show today, and both actually are relevant to our topic. Now, originally you were actually born in the United States, right, and returned to Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's true. I actually was born and raised in a place called Brooklyn that you may have heard of.
Ah, yes.
And that over there in New York City, and that's where I grew up. And I only moved to Israel about 20 years ago.
And what encouraged you or moved you to give up the American lifestyle and move to Israel?
Well, there were certain situations, let's say, that God put me in. Some encounters with different people, and I think one particular encounter, which was in Morocco, of all places. I was traveling through Europe. I said, I want to see someplace different. So I went down to Morocco, and I had an encounter with some Moroccans, Arab Muslims in Morocco, and they said at one point in our discussion, one of them became very agitated, and he started talking about Israel. He said, Jerusalem is for all the Arabs. When he said that, I started to feel something. I started to realize he's talking about Israel. And he was showing me that the entire Arab or Muslim world is united in its antipathy toward Israel. Its hatred of Israel.
Real visceral experience that you just hadn't had before.
That's right.
A real awakening there.
I grew up in a regular, what many people would call a regular Jewish, cosmopolitan New York City background.
You were in academia, right?
I was in academia. I mean, my parents had some Jewish identity and had some feeling for Israel. But we certainly weren't Orthodox Jews. I grew up in public school. I went to public school, and I was influenced by public school, and I had a primarily secular liberal worldview. And it wasn't until I started to really explore what it means to be a Jew, starting with Israel, and what does Israel mean? What's the significance of the return of Israel to its land in our times? Right. That's what led me in the direction that I ended up in. So sometimes people ask the question, well, how does a former atheist from New York City come to be the mayor of Shiloh, Israel, in the West Bank, so to speak? And that's a very compelling question. And in my book, God, Israel, and Shiloh, Returning to the Land, I dealt with those questions, right. and I wrote about those answers to the questions.
Right. Now, Shiloh is a town that is a settlement town. Can you define what that is for people who may not understand that?
Sure. Well, Israel was reestablished as an independent state in 1948. Now, people sometimes forget.
It's young.
If they would watch the major networks on television in the United States, they would think that the Jews just decided that they want to go live in the middle of the Middle East in this little tiny piece of land about the size of New Jersey, surrounded by hostile Arab Muslims, for no reason at all. Or if you listen to President Obama, you might think that the only reason why Israel was established was because 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. The fact is that Israel was re-established because the people of Israel had an independent nation in the Middle East, in the heart of the Middle East, in the land of Israel, what they were then calling Palestine, which was a name that was given by the Romans. The Romans called it Palestina when they drove the Jewish people out of the land. But the fact is that over 2,000 years ago, there was a nation called Israel that existed for well over 1,000 years as a sovereign nation in the Middle East. That's more than three times the current age of the United States of America. So it's important to understand that when we came back, started trickling back near the end of the 1880s, and that flow of Jews back to the land continued until 1948. 1948, we reestablished what once was, and that was a miraculous happening. Right. Because the writings of the prophets speak about this. In the book of Ezekiel, it talks about how the Jews will be scattered from the land, and then God will bring us back in.
Right. So it's really a fulfillment of prophecy. And so it's not as simple as this is a sanctuary nation because the Jews have been persecuted.
That is exactly correct. And so getting to the answer to your question, in 1967, Israel recaptured in the Six-Day War. The Arab nations had been trying to destroy Israel for a long time. They weren't having much success. Through terrorism, through war, through massacres. 1967 comes along. They said, okay, this is the war to end all wars. We're going to destroy Israel. They failed. They didn't succeed. In 6 days, we won the war. On the seventh day, we rested because the seventh day was a Jewish Sabbath. And in those 6 days, we recaptured the old city of Jerusalem with the Temple Mount, where the two holy temples stood during the time that Israel stood as an independent nation under King David, King Solomon. And we recaptured the biblical heartland of Israel, which the world knows as the West Bank, but it's properly known by its correct biblical names, historical names of Samaria and Judea. Samaria is north of Jerusalem. Judea is the region south of Jerusalem. When we recaptured these areas as well as others, then the Arab nations realized, hey, we're not succeeding in getting rid of these Jews who are in our midst and don't belong here in the Middle East because they're not Islamic, they're not Muslim. So they decided, hey, let's create a people. Let's create a new underdog. We'll call them the Palestinian people. And they will consist of all the Arabs who live in the land of Israel. And that's what they did. So it's the greatest lie ever told, and the world has swallowed it.
So there is no ethnic group of Palestinians per se?
No. They are Arab Muslims. In fact, my father-in-law, who was a five-generation Jerusalemite, when he was a child in Israel, he was referred to as a Palestinian. The Arab Muslims who lived there didn't want to be called Palestinians. They said, we are part of the greater Arab nation. We're not Palestinians. But in the mid-1960s, when they started to realize they're not succeeding in destroying this Jewish state, these uppity Jews, they said, Okay, let's try a different tactic. We'll create a new underdog, the Palestinian people. We'll talk about the plight of the Palestinians. We'll talk about how they want to recapture their independent nation. They never had an independent nation. This is a new people. It's an invented people, as Newt Gingrich so accurately said.
Right. Well, I mean, prior to the 1940s and that whole thing, I mean, that whole area was occupied by the Turks, right? And before that, another...
It was occupied by the Ottoman Turks
right.
until 1917, when the League of Nations handed it over to the British. The British controlled it until 1948.
Right.
And if you go back before the Ottoman Turks, so then you have the Christian Crusaders. Before that,
it's just one group after another.
That's right,
kind
but
of a revolving door, and there were no Palestinians there at that time.
Of course
per se,
not. Of
right?
course
I
not.
mean, there weren't the plight of the Palestinians under the Ottoman Turks, right?
No.
Okay. Okay. So just so we're clear about that. So what's this whole controversy about the settlements and that? Where does that come into play?
Well, as I alluded to, in 1948, when Israel was reestablished, all of the Arab nations went to war against Israel. As a result of that war, yes, Israel came into official existence in modern times, but the Arab nations that had attacked Israel took Samaria and Judea, the West Bank, and they took the old city of Jerusalem, where the Holy Temple stood, where the Western Wall is, where the Temple Mount is, where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac, if we go back even further. And so they controlled those areas, and they called it the West Bank. So that was the situation. So in 1967, we recaptured all of those areas, the biblical heartland of Israel, and many idealistic Jews, idealistic Israelis said, we are going to resettle the biblical heartland and rebuild the biblical heartland. The Arab nations didn't like that. And the Arabs who lived in Israel, in the land of Israel, didn't like that either. Now, during the time when Jordan controlled those areas, Jordan, which is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, on the east bank, so to speak. So they said, hey, we have all this land. Doesn't matter that there are historical biblical places there. We are going to settle our people there, and many Jordanians moved there. So when Israel recaptured it, Israel recaptured a region of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which had a lot of Arabs living there already.
Both Jordanians and others.
Right.
Okay.
So then the Jews started coming back. We started settling Shiloh, which is the historical first capital of Israel, where the tabernacle, the precursor to the temple, stood for 369 years. We recaptured in Judea Hebron, which is the place where the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel are buried.
Right.
We recaptured Bethlehem, where, of course, Jesus was born, and King David comes from Bethlehem as well. Right. We recaptured Jericho, which Joshua conquered, and the walls came tumbling down. Yeah. These are all historical, biblical places which are the cradle of Western civilization. Right. However, the Islamic world doesn't look at it like that. The Islamic world doesn't have any respect for the Bible, and they said, no, Jews are not allowed to live here. And as a result of that, we had much of the terrorism and much of the world controversy.
Well, I think it's ironic, and we've even heard it recently, that they say the Jews can't live in what they claim to be their land, but Arabs live in Israel all over the place.
Well, it's
I mean, it's a real double standard
it's
there.
an incredible double standard.
Yeah, right.
But that's because of the nature of Israel and the nature of the Islamic world.
Right.
The nature of the Islamic world is intolerant. There's no tolerance towards other religions. As I wrote about in my book, The Islamic Tsunami, what is the real face of Islam? The real face of Islam is intolerance towards other people, especially Jews and Christians. It says in the Quran, which President Obama calls the Holy Quran. Mm-hmm. Okay? It says in the Quran that Jews and Christians should be hunted down and ambushed. It says that the Jew, it refers to the Jews and the infidels meaning the Christians. It says that we were turned by Allah into apes and monkeys and pigs. This is how Islam speaks about Jews and about Christians.
So no matter what the rhetoric, the definitive guiding light of the Islamic faith is not very tolerant.
That's
very
right.
Intolerant.
But Israel is a democratic country. Mm-hmm. It's a country that holds the values of freedom very dearly. So the Arabs they can live in Israel. They have the right to vote in Israel. So that is the difference. It's a culture. Right. It's a very serious cultural difference. The Islamic civilization, as opposed to the Jewish civilization, which is not exactly the same, but it's primarily similar to the Western world. Right. Israel is primarily a Western country, at least culturally, and there is a conflict there. Right. People don't like to admit that it's a religious conflict, that it's a cultural conflict between two very different civilizations.
Yeah, it's not just a political issue of two morally equivalent nations.
That's right.
Right. Now, you've had a very personal encounter with terrorism, and so what I'd like to do is show this clip that talks about that personal encounter, and then maybe have you explain a little bit more about that. So let's watch this clip.
On December 17, 2001, I was coming back from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son when suddenly there was a massive hail of bullets on the car. I felt a terrible pain in my left leg and the blood started gushing out, pouring all over the place. I looked at my son. His eyes were wide open, his mouth was wide open, but he couldn't move. I managed somehow to get to Ofrad, the next community, where an ambulance rushed us both to the hospital. After recovering from our emergency operations, I found out that my car had 49 bullet holes in it, that my leg would need another operation, and that my son, who had gotten shot in the neck, had miraculously escaped death from a bullet that had missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. While I was in the hospital, I had a lot of time to think. What could be my response to this terror attack? I couldn't hunt the terrorists down because that's a job of the army. But I could build and rebuild what the terrorists were trying to destroy. If they wanted to destroy our life in our homeland, then I was going to rebuild for the future. And the future is our children. And that's why I decided to start the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund.
So, David, can you tell us a little bit more about the aftermath of that terrible attack on you and your son, and how you and your family coped with that?
Well, it wasn't easy, frankly. Any family that has gone through trauma knows that it's not easy, and we have had so many children who've been killed in our communities in Samaria, and Israel as a whole has known so much terrorism, so much war. But we go on with our lives. We go on with our lives, and we are determined that we are going to live our lives to the fullest, that nothing is going to stop us. But I can't say that it was easy. It was traumatic.
How long did that whole ordeal last in terms of the recovery physically and that type of thing? I'd say about 2 years. It was a process of operations. We had several operations, and my son had to go through several months of psychological post-trauma therapy. So it had a huge impact on him.
It had a huge impact on him. It had a huge impact on us.
Yeah, right.
And well, I'm thankful that as a result of that whole experience, I was able to establish the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, which helps so many other families that have gone through that trauma.
Why, it's interesting that you established this fund, because I would think that you would become bitter and angry as a result of your experience. And did you have to struggle with that at all? And is this the outgrowth of dealing with that?
Well, I could tell you that after I was shot and wounded, I could have lined up every single terrorist and shot him myself. That was the feeling that I had right after the terrorist attack. My first day in the hospital. Mm-hmm. But when I started to understand how God had saved our lives, and I started to realize that it happened for a purpose, I realized that it's really the job of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, to capture terrorists. Mm-hmm. It's not my job. As a person at the grassroots, and I may have been the mayor of Shiloh for a period, but I still consider myself to be a person at the grassroots. And my job was to fulfill the mission that God had placed in my hands. He had given me an opportunity to help other children. And frankly, that is the best response to the terrorists. Every time another child goes through our therapy programs and you see the trauma healing, that is the best response to the terrorists. Every time we build a playground in another community in Samaria, that is the best response to the terrorists. The best response isn't to become angry or to go into a deep depression. The best response is to respond to darkness with light, and to respond to bitterness and anger with sweetness and with love. And
so as a result of this, then a new mission evolved and took over your life. Is that right? Do you think that you were targeted because specifically by the terrorists, or you were a random, you and your son who were in the car, just a random car that they went after, or that they knew who you were and that they were going after you?
Frankly, I don't know, and I probably never will know. Mm-hmm. What I do know is that the Palestinian Authority, which is the Arab quasi-governmental group that was created to govern their day-to-day lives, to give them autonomy, which, by the way, has turned into a big disaster because it unleashed the biggest outpouring of terrorism in Israel's history. But anyhow, they were given the authority to issue car licenses. Mm. So they have their own Palestinian license plates. We have our regular Israeli license plates. So every car, every time a car passes, you know if it's a Jewish car or it's an Arab car.
Yeah, I see.
And so while I don't know if they were targeting me because I had been the mayor, I do know that they were targeting us, myself and my 3-year-old son, mm-hmm. because we were Jews. Right. And there is absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah. And in terms of the whole politics of this issue, what do you think the world needs to understand about the issue of the settlements? Because the media has really painted the Israelis as the occupiers, as the interlopers, as the intruders. What don't we know and understand about this issue?
Well, it's very, very interesting to note that the word Palestine in Hebrew if you look at the Hebrew root of the word Palestine, the Hebrew root is polesh, which means one who comes to invade, to take over, and to take over something that doesn't belong to him. So that's kind of interesting, because we know
Ironic.
that every word in the Bible is true. We know that nothing is an accident.
Right.
For those who've done biblical study, we know that nothing is an accident. Every word is there for a reason. So that's just an interesting side note. Look, we know that we are in the land that God gave to his people. And we know that we are in our historical homeland. That was a sovereign Jewish nation for approximately 1,000 years. More than 1,000 years. So we know absolutely that we're doing the right thing, that we're in the right place. And it doesn't matter, it really doesn't matter what the Arab nations say, what the Muslim nations say, and what many misguided Western nations say about our right to the land of Israel. We have an obligation to live in the land of Israel, we have an obligation to rebuild the land of Israel, and we're going to fulfill that mission in our times.
Even if you have to do it by yourself?
Well, we're not by ourselves. We have the Almighty God on our side.
Yeah.
And unless we believe that God is a finicky God that changes his mind, or unless you're a secular person who just doesn't believe it and believes that that the Bible is just an interesting work of literature that happens to be the best-selling book of all time, unless you're in those categories, then you understand that God is standing with the people of Israel. What other nation do you know of that was driven from its biblical heartland, driven from its homeland by an enemy nation, in that case the Romans, who drove the Jewish people around the world, scattered us in every nation. We were persecuted in every nation in which we dwelled. Yes, there were moments when we thrived in the nations in which we dwelled, but eventually we were persecuted in those nations, killed, slaughtered, wounded. And finally, we came back to our land, exactly the way that the prophecy said in Ezekiel. That is a God thing. That is not a normal, this world thing. And I'm proud to be a part of it.
Well, thank you very much. And this has been most interesting, and we look forward to talking with you again about this issue. Has David's story impacted you? Can you tell us on the social media? Thank you so much for watching.